He was a decorated Boston police officer. She was his girlfriend, an ordinary woman with no history of violence, no criminal record, no reason to kill. But on a freezing January night in 2022, John O'Keefe ended up dead alone, in a snowbank outside a fellow officer's home. And the one person police blamed? Karen Read. The story began with a chilling 911 call. A man's body was discovered face down in the snow, bruised and lifeless. That man was John O'Keefe, a respected officer with the Boston Police Department. The location raised immediate eyebrows. He was found in front of the home of another officer, Brian Albert, a longtime friend. But strangely, John never made it inside that house. Karen Read, his girlfriend, told investigators she dropped him off there the night before. She said he had been drinking, didn't want to cause a scene, and she didn't want to go in, so she circled the block. But when he never came out, she began to worry. What seemed like a tragic accident quickly escalated into a full-blown murder investigation. And within days, Karen Read was arrested. Authorities claimed Karen was intoxicated and had hit John with her SUV during a U-turn, leaving him to die in the snow. Their case rested on circumstantial evidence: broken taillight glass near the scene, scratches on her vehicle, and a few words she allegedly said in panic. I hit him, didn't I?" That single sentence would haunt every minute of the investigation. But Karen's defense team quickly raised red flags. According to them, there was no definitive proof she ever hit John. In fact, they argued there was overwhelming evidence to suggest the opposite. They claimed John's injuries didn't align with a hit and run. They were more consistent with a physical altercation. Cuts to his arm, swelling around the eye, and blunt force trauma to the back of his head. And most curiously, the Ring camera at the front of the house, the one that could have captured everything, had conveniently been turned off that night. As investigators built their case against Karen, the public began asking questions of their own. Why didn't anyone in the house hear John arrive? Why didn't his friends notice he never made it inside? Why did certain pieces of evidence seem to disappear? Soon, the trial of Karen Read took on a life of its own. On TikTok, Reddit, and YouTube, theories exploded. Millions of views poured into videos dissecting every detail of the night John died. And a growing number of people started to believe one thing: Karen Read was being framed. Their suspicion wasn't baseless. Detective Michael Proctor, one of the key investigators on the case, was accused of multiple forms of misconduct, failing to properly collect data, overlooking key messages on Karen's phone, and allegedly manipulating reports to fit the prosecution's narrative. The defense said he went so far as to ignore exonerating evidence altogether. Outside the courtroom, protesters lined the sidewalks. Signs read, "Free Karen," and "Investigate the cops." The courthouse became a media circus. Reporters, podcasters, and camera crews waited for every twist. Inside the courtroom, it was chaos. Witnesses contradicted their own statements. Key players in the investigation backtracked or went silent. A neighbor's home security footage mysteriously vanished. And then came one of the most shocking moments of the entire trial. Brian Albert, the homeowner and officer who was supposedly asleep during the incident, refused to testify. He invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. Why would a police officer plead the Fifth in a case where his friend died in front of his home? Why wouldn't he want to help clear up what happened that night? The silence only deepened the mystery. As closing arguments wrapped up, many expected the jury to find Karen Read not guilty across the board. Her attorneys had cast enough doubt to derail the prosecution's story. But when the verdict came in, it caught everyone off guard. Karen was found not guilty of second-degree murder, not guilty of manslaughter, but the jury still convicted her on one charge: driving under the influence. No breathalyzer, no blood alcohol test, no police pullover. Just the assumption that she had been drinking that night, combined with the testimony of people who may have had their own reasons to blame her. Her supporters were furious. In their eyes, the system couldn't convict her of murder, so it pinned something else on her. A lesser charge, but still enough to put her behind bars. The sentencing is still to come. She could face time in prison, even though the most serious accusations were thrown out. But behind the courtroom drama, one haunting question still lingers. If Karen Reed didn't kill John O'Keefe, then who did? Who turned off that security camera? Who saw John that night, moments before he died? And why are police officers, sworn to protect and serve, so unwilling to testify under oath? Because someone knows what really happened that night. Someone out there has the answers. When the verdict came in, there was shock, but not silence. Karen Reed had just been found not guilty of second-degree murder, not guilty of manslaughter, yet guilty of driving under the influence. To many watching around the world, the outcome didn't feel like justice. It felt like a compromise, one meant to satisfy both sides without truly answering the most important question. What really happened to Officer John O'Keefe on that freezing January night? In the weeks after the trial, pressure began to mount, not just on prosecutors, but on the police department itself. The entire case had raised serious concerns. Mishandled evidence, conflicting witness statements, and the looming suspicion that Karen Reed had been a scapegoat from the beginning. Let's rewind. John O'Keefe was found outside 34 Fairview Road, the home of fellow officer Brian Albert. According to Reed, she had dropped John off there after a night of drinking. But the prosecution's theory was that she had backed into him with her SUV during a U-turn, killing him and leaving the scene. On paper, it was a plausible theory. But in court, and in the court of public opinion, it crumbled under scrutiny. John's injuries were inconsistent with being struck by a vehicle. He had no pelvic fractures, no broken legs, no massive blunt force trauma to the torso. Instead, he had injuries to his head, his arm, and strange abrasions that looked more like the result of a beating than a car crash. Forensic experts clashed on the stand. One said the wounds could be caused by a car. Another insisted they couldn't. Yet a third pointed to the possibility that John had already been unconscious, possibly even dead, before he ever touched the snow. Even more troubling was the handling of key evidence. Karen's SUV was towed and searched days after the incident. Giving time, her defense argued, for tampering or cross-contamination. Her phone was seized, but crucial text messages were missing. And then there was the taillight, supposedly broken during the collision that killed John. But fragments found near the scene didn't match up cleanly with the timeline. Some were too far from the body. Others appeared after the initial search. Could they have been planted? And what about the most telling evidence of all, the surveillance footage? According to Karen's legal team, the Ring camera at Brian Albert's house had been disabled or disconnected that night. Police never recovered any footage of John's arrival, his movements, or what happened in the minutes after he was dropped off. This, for many, was the moment the case stopped being about negligence and started becoming something more sinister. In court, the most damning cracks began to show in the form of silence. Brian Albert, the homeowner and key figure, invoked his Fifth Amendment rights. He refused to testify, citing potential self-incrimination. Another family member who had been in the house also declined to take the stand. And then came Detective Michael Proctor, the lead investigator. Proctor's credibility was under fire long before the trial began. Accusations against him included failing to log evidence correctly, ignoring potential exculpatory evidence, and most damning of all, making jokes and inappropriate remarks about Karen Reed in private texts, suggesting bias. The defense claimed Proctor had made up his mind from the beginning and worked backward to build the case against her. During cross-examination, his answers were evasive. Records were missing. Emails had been deleted. It painted a picture not of professional law enforcement, but of a system willing to bend the rules to protect its own. Outside the courtroom, the protests only grew louder. Hundreds gathered daily with signs that read, #JusticeForJohn and #FreeKaren. Online, millions dissected every piece of testimony. True crime channels exploded with coverage. The case had become more than a trial. It had become a symbol of a system under scrutiny. And then came the revelation that stunned even those who thought they'd seen it all. Shortly after the verdict, it was revealed that a private investigator working for Karen's defense had uncovered documents suggesting another officer may have destroyed internal communications related to the case. These weren't just text messages, they were internal reports, emails, and memos, all gone. When questioned, the department claimed routine deletion policies. But legal experts argued that evidence tied to an active murder case should have been preserved. Had the destruction been accidental or intentional? More questions emerged than answers. Why would Brian Albert, a veteran officer, refuse to testify about what happened in his own home? Why didn't anyone inside the house come out when John allegedly lay dying just a few feet away? Why were first responders reportedly told to stay quiet? And who gave that order? Even the cause of death, hypothermia combined with blunt force trauma, was debated by experts. One medical examiner claimed John would have likely died quickly, within minutes. Another said he could have lived for over an hour, if someone had gotten to him in time. Either way, it raised one horrifying possibility. Someone might have watched him die. And all the while, Karen's fate hung in limbo. Her sentencing for the DUI conviction was still pending, with prosecutors demanding jail time. Her legal team vowed to appeal, and hinted that new evidence might soon come to light. Meanwhile, Karen Reed's supporters doubled down. They began calling for a federal investigation, demanding the Justice Department review the conduct of the local police. A petition started online gathered over 150,000 signatures in under a week. The people wanted answers, and they weren't going away. But even with all the evidence, the protests, and the outrage, the biggest mystery remained unsolved. Who really killed John O'Keefe? If it wasn't Karen Reed, and the jury clearly had its doubts, then who had motive, means, and opportunity? Was it someone inside that house? A fellow officer with something to hide? Or was this death not the result of murder at all, but a cover-up gone terribly wrong? The answer may lie in one final, unreleased report, a police document known as the Supplemental Incident Log, which was redacted in court and never shown to the public. According to a whistleblower, this document contains a timeline of who was in the house that night, and what they saw. If that's true, then someone knows. It had been more than 2 years since the night John O'Keefe's lifeless body was found lying in the snow. More than 2 years since Karen Reed had first been accused of murder. The nation had watched the courtroom drama unfold, dissected every piece of evidence, debated the verdict, and demanded answers. But long after the jury had spoken and the protests faded, one question still lingered in the air like fog on a winter night. What really happened to Officer John O'Keefe? After the surprising verdict where Karen Reed was found not guilty of second-degree murder and manslaughter, yet still convicted of driving under the influence, the case didn't quietly disappear. In fact, it only grew louder. Public interest intensified. National media outlets ran op-eds questioning the integrity of the investigation. Podcasts and YouTube creators uncovered new angles. Whistleblowers began to emerge. And that's when the story took its final, most explosive turn. In the weeks following the trial, Karen's defense team made a bold claim. There was key evidence that had never been admitted into court. Evidence that, if presented, could have blown the entire case wide open. Among the most significant was a heavily redacted internal police document called the Supplemental Incident Log. For months, it had been withheld under the justification of ongoing internal review. But a leak changed everything. An anonymous source from within the department provided a version of the report to Karen's legal team. What it revealed was staggering. The log outlined a conflicting timeline of when officers at Brian Albert's home claimed to have gone to bed, when lights were seen turning off, and when John O'Keefe was allegedly dropped off. The most damning line read, "At 12:19 a.m., an unidentified male exited the residence briefly, returning with visible snow on footwear. This individual later denied stepping outside when questioned." This statement didn't match any testimony given during trial. It suggested someone in that house, someone trusted, possibly even a fellow officer, was outside near the time of John's death, and may have lied under oath. Karen Reed's attorneys immediately filed a motion to reopen the case, not to retry the same charges, but to expose a potential conspiracy that had extended far beyond the original investigation. It wasn't just about her innocence anymore. It was about systemic corruption and possible obstruction of justice. The public's response was explosive. Demonstrations reignited in Boston. Protesters demanded accountability not just for Karen, but for the entire chain of command involved in the investigation. The governor's office issued a statement acknowledging public concern and calling for a special independent review. And then came the breaking point. A second officer, who asked to remain anonymous for safety reasons, came forward to the media under the protection of a whistleblower attorney. This officer claimed that in the days following John's death, they were instructed not to pursue leads involving individuals inside the home. Instead, all focus was to be directed toward Karen Red. They described the internal atmosphere as one of fear, where questioning the narrative meant risking your career. According to this officer, evidence pointing to inconsistencies in the taillight theory was dismissed. Alternative suspects were ignored. Statements that contradicted the official timeline were simply not written into the final reports. This was no longer a theory. It was a cover-up. At the same time, digital forensic experts conducted a third-party review of Karen's SUV data logs and GPS systems. Their findings were conclusive. Her car never made the sharp turn into the position that would have allowed a reverse trajectory striking John where his body was found. The angle of impact proposed by prosecutors, the experts argued, was mechanically impossible without a completely different positioning of the vehicle. In other words, the crash, the entire foundation of the original case, may have never happened at all. Meanwhile, Karen Reed's DUI sentencing loomed. Prosecutors sought jail time, even though the charge now felt more symbolic than substantive. But public opinion had shifted dramatically. News outlets questioned whether it was ethical, or even constitutional, to continue punishing her after a trial marred by so many irregularities. And in a surprising moment of restraint, the judge sentenced Karen not to jail, but to probation and community service, citing overwhelming public scrutiny, lack of intent, and inconsistencies in the investigation. For Karen Red, it was bittersweet. She was free but not cleared. Still, she didn't retreat from the spotlight. In fact, she did the opposite. Karen began speaking out. She gave interviews, held press conferences, and pushed for the state to open a full-scale investigation into how her case was handled. What began as a defense strategy had evolved into a larger mission: justice for John O'Keefe and for herself. In the months that followed, the Massachusetts Attorney General's office launched a formal review of the case. Internal affairs units reopened files. Detectives and officers who had once stood firm in their statements were now facing subpoenas. The thin blue wall that had protected some from scrutiny was finally beginning to crack. But for many, it was still not enough. Because in the end, John O'Keefe, a respected police officer, a man loved by his nieces and nephews, a public servant, was still dead. And no one had been held accountable. The court may have spared Karen Red, but it never answered the question that haunted this case from the very beginning. Who killed John O'Keefe? The forensic evidence pointed away from Karen. The timeline pointed toward someone inside the house. The silence, the redactions, the withheld footage, all of it screamed that something darker had happened that night. Was it an accident that turned into panic? A fight among friends that spiraled out of control? Or was it something worse? Something that involved more than one person and required the cooperation of those who had sworn to uphold the law? We may never get the full truth. We may never know exactly what happened between the moment John O'Keefe stepped out of Karen's car and the moment his body was discovered. But one thing is clear: Karen Red wasn't the only person on trial. This case put a police department, a legal system, and a community under the microscope. It showed how easily truth can be buried under protocol, how quickly justice can be distorted when those in power protect their own, and how even in the face of overwhelming suspicion, it's still possible for someone to lose years of their life for a crime they may never have committed. Karen Reed's story is over. But the story of what happened in Canton, Massachusetts, that cold, silent night, is not. Because somewhere out there, someone knows exactly how John O'Keefe died. And one day the truth might speak, even if those sworn to protect it never will.